Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I am Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation. And I'm really excited about this conversation today. Last week, some of you might have heard me talk about this AI Equity Lab. It is actually going to be a place to workshop domestic issues when it comes to civil and human rights compliance on AI systems that are being generated today that need some further dialogue with a multi-stakeholder group. And some of you might have also heard me mention this idea of Brookings coming in and really interrogating AI governance from the perspective of other countries that are not the US and EU. What do I mean by that? There are countries like the African Union, India, the Caribbean, Latin America, who are actually doing this work. And it's so important if we talk about AI equity to include them in the conversation. In many respects, we're quickly learning that technology and particularly AI governance is geopolitical. And so expanding the actors that sit at the table to make some discussions and really talk through what AI governance looks like in their country and how that globally is interoperable is something that I am really excited to do. And I'm excited to do it with actually a new face that's on this call, which is Dr. Chinasa Okolo, who is a new fellow in the Center for Technology Innovation, who is actually also a panelist. So if you haven't met her and you don't know anything about her, go look her up, because I'm so excited that she is actually helping to lead this project going forward. Listen, this is a webinar, so the etiquette is this. If you have questions, please send them to events@brookings.edu, events@brookings.edu. And if you're following the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag AI Global South, AI Global South. With that, I want to jump into this conversation. Got you for an hour, and thank you for taking your time out to be with us. First, let me just introduce everybody that you see on the screen. And when they speak, they can tell you a little bit more about their organization and who they are. We have Asta Kapoor, who is co-founder and director of the Opti Institute, who is joining us, by the way, from India. So we're going to be mindful of her time and be gracious of the fact that she is still awake. Bruno Biani, who is founder and director of Data Privacy Brazil. We've got Chinasa Okolo, who is the fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation, and my dear, dear friend for many years, Landry Signe, who is senior fellow in global economy and development at Brookings Africa Growth Initiative. And I'm so glad that Landry can join us, because at Brookings, we try to do stuff cross-collaboration. And so really excited about bringing in the perspective and voices of Landry, who has contributed to the Tech Tank blog over the years. I want to jump in with this first question, though, and Chinasa, I'll direct it to you, just in terms of where we are today. Again, as I've mentioned, many of the conversations that we have when it comes to AI regulation or governance happens on a very bilateral basis, right? It tends to be very much a conversation around EU, US interoperability, and other countries come in, obviously, as a representation of the EU, but rarely do we have these conversations around the role of the conglomerate Global South. In particular, how they actually view these issues. And I think many of you know, I've written on 5G and other technological inputs, and oftentimes it's a reaction to what's actually happening in the global economy. Speak to us first, Chinasa, about the potential advantages and drawbacks of involving or not involving these countries, right? At this critical time where AI governance is really a top of mind for most folks. And speak more generally, and we'll get into more details with the other panelists, on why having these actors at the table really makes sense for where we are right now when it comes to AI regulation.
Yeah, so thank you, Nicole, for that first question, and also very happy to be here. Just to address, some of the drawbacks, that could occur if, countries in the global south are not involved in these global conversations on AI, especially when it comes to the formation of what we consider to be global standards or norms around AI regulation and governance. If these countries are not included, there could be, valuable perspectives that are left out, given that these countries have, very different cultural and socioeconomic differences. And so it's really important to understand how AI development and regulation can account for this. And one thing I also think about as well, which is like the potential possibility of the increased misuse of AI, as bad actors try to take advantage of loopholes, especially when it comes to things like, let's say, like data labeling and data work just in general. We've seen a lot of that work outsourced to the global south. And, this could possibly be due to different labor regulations that occur within these areas. And so it's really important to understand like how AI as a whole we can avoid some of those issues as well.
Well, I love that way that you're prefacing it, right? Because as we've spoken about with the AI Equity Lab, part of this conversation that we're having, folks, is a conversation of, the stringent guardrails that we're all talking about across the world, right? In terms of data protection, in terms of, technical cadence of AI systems, risk management, et cetera. But I do like how you're bringing in data workers and labeling. And when you start to think about this conversation we're having today, folks, part of the reason why I think this is so critical is that these countries just do not supply labor as well, right? They actually play a critical role in shaping foundational policies as well as systems. So Bruno, I want to come to you because on the Latin American front, I know you've been very, very active on the data privacy side as they relate to AI governance systems and other autonomous machines. Talk to us a little bit about how Latin America is thinking about AI governance and what particular contribution we need to hear from you, right, in your representation that could be enhancing the current conversations we're having today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for an invitation, Nicole. It's a really pleasure to share this panel with all of you. And I'd like to begin to echo what Chinaiza highlighted before, like Global South, it's like not a kind of universal umbrella. We do have a lot of similarities, but we do have a lot of difference, and it's not different in Latin America as well. And but we do have also common challenges, and I'd like to highlight three of them. As Chinaiza highlighted before, labor rights. We are seeing how the Global South is like the human infrastructure for data labeling, and we have to have this discussion frankly, how we should advance by providing real labor rights and labor protection. So it's quite important, the movement that Lula, president of Brazil, and Biden is doing right now, maybe thinking about G20 next year. Also about the environmental impacts of AI. We could see how the Global South countries, we are seeing illegal extraction of minerals, gold, which is, let's say, the material effects of AI and the really true side effects of AI in the whole production. So I'd like to highlight two of them to start: labor and environmental impacts of AI. I think those are two priorities and common challenges in the Global South. And at the end of the day, it's about inequality, how AI is reinforcing inequalities in the Global South countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Listen, we're coming out of the gate real quick on this, which I actually appreciate how we've started this conversation because I had different things I was thinking about, Bruno. But I think we're seeing a common thread, which I think really ties to, if I may, as a sociologist, some of the colonial perspectives that we've had when we think about the participation of other countries in very dominant conversations. Landry, let me jump over to you for a minute because your work, and particularly your recent book, if I may plug, really begins to look at some of these geopolitical concerns. Talk to us a little bit about like the AI space and how it contextualizes itself generally in technological development. And from what you've heard so far from our colleagues, where are we landing then in this conversation? And because I'm hoping at the end of this, you all, that we can kind of structure some of the things that are important to us, and particularly for those people that are listening today.
First, thank you so much, Nicol, for having me today. It's always a pleasure to engage with you and to contribute to the phenomenal work that you are doing. And I'm honored to also share this panel with many distinguished members of the community. So there are a few points when we speak, and thank you for pointing out to my book, Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution. When it really comes to AI regulation, governance discussions, some of the challenges that we have in the Global South are relatively similar to the one that we have in the North, with the difference that the velocities, the velocity, the scope, the system impact, the complexity, those dimensions are perhaps better organized, better mastered in some of the advanced economies. So the first dimension that I want to highlight, the pacing challenge. So that is a core dimension that countries in Africa, in Latin America, some of the Asian countries are facing, the incredible speed, which is difficult to match, meaning in terms of AI innovation, development, and of the new applications among other. Corporations are progressing, are innovating, are developing new technologies, new applications with an incredible speed, which is difficult to match by government in the West, and let alone government in the global South. So that is one key dimension. A second key dimension is really the coordination challenge, the multiplicity of actors, as Chinasa has mentioned, Bruno has also mentioned. So we have various actors, whether we speak about the more traditional governmental one, whether we speak about the civil society, the corporation. So it really requires a multi-stakeholder type of approach to governance. There's also one dimension, the agenda or norm setting challenge, especially related to the global AI architecture. This brings us to the question, who governs? Who is leading the way? Who sets the agenda? And in this area also, many of the countries in the developing world are rather following versus leading the way. As a matter of fact, if you only speak about Africa, in terms of AI readiness, only 4 countries are above the global average. So namely Mauritius, Egypt, South Africa, Tunisia. So that just gives an illustration of the asymmetry that we have. And let me finish by highlighting also, I mentioned the pacing challenge, the coordination challenge, the agenda and norm setting challenge related to the global AI architecture, but also something that I like to call the special global South challenge or special African challenge. Whether we speak about sovereignty, Nicol, you mentioned about that perspective, who is dominating, inclusion, ethics, revenue or resource sharing to unlock the potential, or whether we speak about human rights, research and development, tech transfer policy, or AI skills, citizen perception and attitudes toward AI, as well as the imperative to innovate for the countries of the global South and not just be the consumer. I can't expand, but let me get back to additional points later.
No, we're going to come back to this because I think you actually raised awareness, particularly for people who are watching. You did 2 things outside of laying out, I think, a very a nicely scripted plan in terms of where we need to be putting our time. But you also indicated that we're not a homogenous group, even under the guise of Global South, right? The African Union consists of a variety of countries that are part of that continent. Latin America, right, Bruno, has a variety of cultural niches that will factor into what people value, what they do not value. That difference based on political regime, it may differ based on what you said, civil society. And India, right, Asta, is different as well when we start to think about northern and southern regions and where people fit in the digital ecosystem. So we're going to come back to those points, Landry. That's my point, right? Chinasa started us on a good path. Let's keep going, right? I want to talk about that because a lot of what you've been looking at yourself through your institute is like responsible AI and data privacy practices, particularly as they feed into these emerging technology systems. Speak to us a little bit about what you're seeing across the landscape in terms of responsible AI, and more specifically around what we're seeing in India, because a lot of people do not realize just how dominant India has been in creating a force for change of AI norms and standards. Then going back to Landry's point, the extent to which we're interoperable with those standards and those norms is actually going to be the huge question going forward. So Asa, I'll come over to you next.
Thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks for having me. It's just a pleasure to be here with friends and new faces. So wonderful discussion already. You know, as you said, a lot has been discussed. One is, of course, the geographical eclecticism, which is the global South. There's the cultural norms that you also spoke about. There's also the readiness that Landry spoke about, which I think must be really considered quite deeply, is how ready are we to govern, to develop. But the the sort of framework I was thinking about was actually three-pronged, which is, what are the inputs into AI itself, which is the data labeling that everybody spoke about, which of course Global South has become the hotbed of. ChatGPT has shown us exactly the expanse of it. And we in India have been studying data labeling for the last few years. And, it has become the click workers, the same way that the business processing units of the 90s and early 2000s were. That kind of work is now coming back to India. So it's very interesting to see that chain come back again. The second part of it is the development of the data sets. So, how do we think about the representativeness and the quality of data? How do we think about the completeness from the Global South perspective, but also, Nicol, like you said, the standardization and interoperability? Those are going to be really big questions. And again, I don't think we have good answers to that in a large part of the Global South. And this is the only point that I can make as a broad sweep. We still have Excel sheets and PDFs going into various government documents. So I think that there is a big question about data itself and how do we make sure that the data that we generate in the Global South is usable for AI. Related to that is also models, right? Where are the models being developed and what data are they being trained on? We know that the climate change predictions are being made of data sets that belong to the global now through models that are being developed with assumptions in the global model. So you don't even actually know what the climate implications in places in the Global South will be because of how skewed the data modeling is. And the last one then is on the use and the potential harms of AI and what is being done around that. And I think that if we divide the entire AI life cycle or chain into each of these bits, then I think regulation as a whole picture becomes much easier to understand. And then, we've seen things like risk and use-based frameworks coming up. India has been suggesting that we need a broader AI framework, which actually also has a domestic as well as an international cooperation, because I think what is also being realized is that the harms of AI are both bizarrely felt at the level of individual users, communities, citizens, but also much more globally. The way that we use ChatGPT is a very global experience, for instance. So there's also a need for a global coordination. And just a last point to make on that is that what we're seeing now is a very interesting moment with Brazil taking on the G20 presidency and India, Brazil, and South Africa bringing the Troika, the expansion of BRICS. There are lots of opportunities for coordination within the Global South, which are coming up. And the point on India's position is that India has been pushing the broader agenda of digital public infrastructure, which actually provides an interesting alternative to the hegemony of global technological systems that we've been thinking about. So I'll speak more on that when I come in next.
Yes. Listen, that's so funny that you actually bring that up, Asta, in terms of India and the global infrastructure, because as you said, if you can go historically to look at where India placed and found itself over the course of the digital revolution. And it's interesting, we're sort of coming back to this conversation again, and Janasa, I want to jump over to you on, some of these ethical concerns, right? These ethical concerns that will have some technical implications. And it sounds, if I close my eyes, I would think I was sitting in Congress with regards to some of the things that we're sort of talking about right now. But how difficult or hard will it be, Janasa, to really talk about data ethics or AI ethics when it comes to bringing in a different contingent that has, as we're hearing, much more leveled concerns when it comes to the design and development and deployment of AI? Just kind of take us down this route. Like, how do we look at the ethics of this so that we don't create, I think I'm hearing from everybody, a technology that becomes one of suppression, right? Where we're sort of pushed to the side in terms of its original origins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so most definitely. I think the main issue is that we really don't understand how AI doesn't work for the majority of the world. We've seen a lot of different use cases come out, from the West, and they focus on Western context. So let's say, for example, like facial recognition systems. And so I think this research has been very helpful in understanding, like how these systems don't work on darker skin tones or just like, or don't work for people of certain races. But again, the concept of race is mainly Western, and we don't really understand like other variables, how AI systems as a whole may impact communities in the global South who may prioritize things like religion or caste or like tribe affiliation. And so it's really important that as governments, work to advance their AI regulation, that they invest in academics, from these regions or their respective countries, to do this work to understand this fundamental, to have a fundamental understanding, of the impacts of ethical AI. And so,
but that makes sense, right? Because a lot of what we talk about the countries on this, we're seen as markets, new markets, right? That's usually the frame. These are new markets for technological deployment. I write a lot on 5G technologies. We sort of saw that in the case of 5G infrastructure and member Landry products and services. And we saw Africa as becoming one of the new markets and consumers of 5G technologies, simply because what they had already done when it came to proof of concept on wireless. It seems to me, and Bruno, I want to bring you in on here, right? We're sort of importing into this conversation some other areas that are not necessarily discussed in the United States, right? Outside of, ethics, as Shanasa has said, norms and standards, climate is something that, we don't often talk about here in the US. I'm curious, what about data privacy, right? And how does that factor into this conversation? Because the United States doesn't have a federal standard. It makes no sense that we are still without a federal president. That's another panel for another time. But just curious, how does that actually import itself into this conversation as well?
Yes, definitely. I'd like to say that data protection laws are, let's say, one of the best tools that we have to govern AI right now. Like we have more than 100 countries that have comprehensive data protection laws. So a concrete example, when we are discussing about discrimination, about amplification of inequalities, we are discussing how automated decision-making is doing wrong choice, basically. And data protection laws have a plenty of rights, such as the revision of an automated decision-making, such as the explicability or the transparency requirements in a way that data subjects should be aware how they are being judged and treated. And this is like a big tool, because we have a lot of constitutional values in common, such as due process. We are talking about due process, informational due process. So that is one of the trends, regulatory trends that we are seeing, not only in Brazil, but also in other jurisdictions. But I would say also that we have to be aware that data protection laws are not like the silver bullet, because we are also discussing about data without being personal data. So as Ashta pointed out, we are having a discussion about data as an infrastructure. And then we have to harmonize data protection laws with open data policies, because we do have to reshape antitrust law. We do have to redress monopolies, data monopolies, but we do have to see what is the role of the state, of the governments, by advancing open data policies in order to break the barrier of entries, which our economy could take leverage of our data in order to mitigate anti-discriminations, automate decision making. And third, I would say that impact assessments, not only data protection impact assessments, but also algorithm impact assessments. But so far, I would say that the enforcement of those tools are quite weak, because we are not having public scrutiny on them. And consequently, we are not reducing the asymmetry of information to have, as Landry pointed out, a network governance in order to flourish the benefits of AI, and not only having the risks and the side effects of AI. So at the end of the day, it's still a debate about reducing the asymmetry of information and consequently of the power in this economic chain.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay there for a moment. If anybody else wants to sort of contribute to that in terms of the importance, because I think that becomes one of the areas which is a pressure point that even in EU-US conversations, obviously the EU has general data protection rules. Here in the United States, we don't. I mean, obviously, these are American companies, that maybe we don't want to subject that much punitive harm when it comes to some of these processes. But for others, are you seeing data protection and these other importing itself into the conversation in the Global South when it comes to AI governance? Just curious. Ashta,
I actually think that I'm glad that Bruno is as optimistic as he is. I think that it would be a case-to-case basis. And I think what's fundamentally important is that data protection starts from the rights of the users themselves, which is protection. But whereas in the context of AI, harm is imposed on people whose data, so it's relational. It's not just people whose data is used, but also people who are impacted populations. And that's what data protection legislations, whether it's the GDPR or the one in India, leave out entirely. So impact is not necessarily understood beyond privacy and protection. And so I think that the existing frameworks around data protection, I would even stick my neck out and say globally, do not take into consideration the potential of AI and across the life cycle of AI, as we've been talking about. So it doesn't talk about the genesis of harms, which is from the representation of the data or the biases embedded in it. It only focuses on privacy and protection, which is an important but limited lens into the potential for harm and risks in the AI, or at least how we understand it at the moment.
Well, and that's interesting, right? Because I think if I think about the United States and I think of the AI Bill of Rights, right, there is an assumption, even though it's a non-binding agreement, that it's leading with digital rights for citizens. Going forward, it will be interesting to see how this factors in the conversation. I think what's happening here in the US is whether or not we should be doing privacy and AI legislation at the same time. And there's some people saying, actually, we shouldn't, right? We need to really address the privacy concerns before we get to the AI. But there are plenty of people, because of the urgency of the matter, who want to do both. That's just my side note. Listen, if you're watching us and you have questions, events@brookings.edu. And if you're on Twitter, AI Global South. I'm going to be going to questions shortly, and I want to make sure I said that again if you joined us late. Landry, there's so many ways I want to go, but I want to actually pick up on this conversation that you talked about with regards to the multiplicity of actors that actually are in the African Union, and really speak to and raise awareness about their different approaches to technological advancement, particularly AI, things like privacy. Sort of break that down for us, because I do want people to understand, as we encroach on this topic here and in the future, that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution either, which is what you've also said.
Absolutely. And I want to highlight, meaning when we speak about AI and when you speak about AI governance in general, especially related to the Global South, most of the conversations will be about potential harms, but not enough about the ability to enable, to empower, to unlock economic development, address health challenges, transportation, education, public services, food production, disabilities, among others. So it's also important when you think about the governance of AI to think about what conducive environment could be created, in fact, to enable innovation, to enable I would say domestic endogenous innovation, and not just the transfer of already existing technology, because in the conception, in the development, that's also one of the best ways to bring value, to bring a different perspective to the development. So that's one of the elements that I really wanted to highlight, that when we think about the governance of AI, let's also think about AI research, AI development, skills development, innovation, infrastructure, and the various dimensions which will really encourage innovation in the global, in this context. A second dimension also, of course, when you speak about Africa, we speak about 54 countries, and some will even speak about 55 if you include the Western Sahara, which is a member of the African Union. But the countries, for example, with some of the largest number of AI will include South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, Ghana. So those are some of the countries which are really leading the way. And it's important to take that into consideration when you speak about the continent. And in terms of government, in terms of policy framework, Mauritius is really the country which came first with a national AI strategy, aiming really at enabling the development of AI in the country. Egypt has also followed. Then you have Tunisia, which is also playing an important role, Botswana, Nigeria, among others. And when it comes to the broader African Union, so you know that the African Union has developed really a digital transformation strategy, which is inclusive of the AI dimension. AI also has been extensively discussed in many of the various platforms. So there's really the idea of how can we coordinate the actions of African countries. And there also, I think it is not either or, because when people think, typically they will consider, let's have the African Union lead the way, but member states are what makes the African Union. And it's important to have some of the African Union member states leading the way and building a coalition, if I may say, of the willing, which could really help facilitate the coordination efforts, the policy development, the capacity building, among others. So I will pause there. There's so much to say about this, and it's very exciting, as you can see, but I will pause there for now.
Landry, I'll be looking for a blog from you, okay, for Tech Day. So I'm gonna give you a chance to write it all out as well. Shanasa, did you want to add anything to what Landry is speaking? And then I want to go to Ashton, and I have a couple questions for you all in the queue before we go to Q&A. But anything to add on that, just in terms of the granularity of the African Union when we start talking about AI governance and strategy?
Yeah, most definitely. I think it's really important to understand the capacity that each country has to develop and also to implement these AI governance frameworks, and then also really try to understand how they can ensure compliance, with these rules. I think that we've seen a lot of use cases when it comes to GDPR, for example, like tech companies continually say like violate these respective norms. And so it will be important for African countries to understand how to ensure compliance. And then also wanted to highlight the work that the AU is doing on a continental, I would say like level to develop the AU AI continental strategy for Africa, something I'm also personally involved in as well. And so I think this will help set a good groundwork for countries to develop their own respective AI strategies, and looking forward to sharing that
as we because it's so interesting, right? That part of Chinasa, you and I have spoken about this, is to sort of unpackage these big grandiose statements that we're all the same, right? We do have, from what I've heard so far, some consistent themes when it comes to climate equity, as well as, being able to, and I like, Landry, the way you're talking about it, being able to be, instead of the tech transfer subject, but leading the way in terms of very constructive dialogue on these things, because every country that is represented here, and including the Caribbean, have in some way sort of investigated and interrogated these technological uses, if not been ahead when it came to the adoption of new technologies. We have a podcast on that, around the digital divide, that we recorded when the African Summit was taking place here in Washington, D.C. But also that kind of brings me to India, because India is not small, right? It's not saying, Bruno, that Latin America is small. It's just more diverse, as well as the Caribbean when it comes to different countries. But India is also quite large when it comes to this conversation as well. And from my understanding over the years, there are regional differences as well in terms of how people adopt the technology or even work in the digital economy itself. Speak to us a little bit about, perhaps similar trends that we'll see in India when it comes to regional development or AI governance there as well.
So I think, India is obviously vast and diverse, and usage of technologies is not homogeneous. What we're also seeing is, and I'll go back to the digital public infrastructure point, because I think it's a little bit of a game changer when it comes to the conversation on AI, particularly from the Global South perspective. And Bruno and I have spent a lot of time over the last couple of months talking about this. But, what India has been able to do is create these digital railroads, which allow for payments infrastructure,
infrastructure, which allow for ID systems to reach. Now we're in a position where we're helping and working with other countries in the African and Southeast Asian regions to build similar systems, because connectivity in the last mile, which is independent, open, public infrastructure, is absolutely critical, because that's what starts to build the basis for how you're going to become more digital and data-driven economies. And what that is doing is that some of the major issues around the diverse experiences with regard to accessing technology is slowly changing. India has also got an interesting consent framework, or which is going to be very, very critical when it comes to actualizing data protection legislations globally. There are problems, of course, there are breakdowns, as there will be, but I think what it does is it offers an interesting alternative to some of the big critical infrastructure that we're seeing being built by big tech. And that's where the leadership position of India, and also coming as a global south, there's language around this being the new non-aligned movement, and we can pick and choose it whether we like it or not. But what it does is it offers an alternative. Brazil's PIX, which is the digital payment system, is also a type of digital public infrastructure. So this makes the conversation quite interesting from the global south perspective, which is being built within global south countries, being built for global south countries, and it then is built for interoperability, is built to talk to one another, and is built to foster collaboration from governance to moving money, payments, data, people, all of that, which India has been leading the way on, and I think that will have serious implications over the next couple of years in the way this conversation unfolds, particularly, Nicol, from the digital divide perspective, and then has give for as we think about AI governance.
Yes, I love the way you're talking about that. And also I love the fact that you included our Southeast Asian countries, right? Because they play a critical role, I think, in the global South conversations, particularly as they innovate their systems. And I've had the opportunity to speak to many of those countries as well. But I also like this idea that, and this is why I love this conversation we're having today, in all honesty. Years ago, I was in the State Department right before I came to Brookings, and I was asking the State Department in the first iteration of technological evolution, when we're sort of moving away seriously from analog. And I went to them and I said, hey, we've got mobile health, we've got mobile banking, we've got all of these things that are running over digital architecture in other countries. And yet across the water here in DC, many people can't get access to those things. There were a lot of reasons for that, folks, that we weren't able to express the same type of digital public infrastructure. Hopefully with our infrastructure bill, we'll be able to do so. But this brings me to this conversation that we started with, which is this conversation around geopolitical concerns, right? There's always something that is embedded in why the countries that we're referencing have not been able to be a dominant force at the table in these conversations. And so I'm going to open it up to all of you. I mean, what we're talking about today is obviously the opportunities that are already being discussed and sort of debated among participating countries, but how do we address some of these conversations? And Landry sort of indicated that where tech transfer primary goal, or procurement, using countries as new markets as compared to new producers, or finding ways in which, making the excuse, I'll put it quite simply, that countries are not necessarily going to be all in these conversations because of their existing data privacy laws, or some things we're not thinking about some of the Latin American countries in terms of the state of civil society. What do we do with those conversations so that we can advance much more broader and expansive participation of the global South at conversations, particularly the one that's happening this week, but at conversations that are advancing AI regulation, governance, and values and norms? How should we show up? Or are we constricted by some of those geopolitical concerns that have been there for quite some time? So not to put anybody on the spot, but just asking to all of you, how do we show up in these conversations in light of some of the political history that we have? Landry?
Okay, so I will go as, so I see a few dimensions. So the first one is really multilateralism or multi-stakeholder engagement. both through the already existing and established global institutions or through new organizations. For example, Asta and I were at the World Economic Forum Global Future Concerts annual meeting in Dubai. I just arrived this morning, as a matter of fact. So, and we discussed many of those questions, the question of geopolitics, and one of our colleagues, Nicol, I think published in a blog earlier or this year, or perhaps was a year ago or so, the countries who will lead the artificial intelligence by 2030 will be the countries who will dominate the 21st century. So that is a dimension. So again, this race for the domination of AI research, AI production and governance, it's also about a broader race of global power. And when I mention involvement through international organizations, for example, the United Nations is a key tool for emerging nations to have a voice. So facilitate international discussion about AI policy standards. You have organizations such as the International Telecommunication Union who can help along those lines. Perhaps one of the challenges there will be the enforcement mechanism. So we have the G20. The G20 also offer another very nice platform to address some of the challenges and opportunities. The World Economic Forum, as I mentioned, the AI governance, global governance commissions could also really help researching and providing some of the recommendations. So I want to first highlight some of the already existing platform, but on the other hand, you also have the bilateral engagement and cooperation through the continental organization. For example, Chinasa has highlighted beautifully the role played by the African Union as well, in which he's involved. So those are the type of engagement, because African countries, given the space that they have, will be stronger by acting together. So I will pause there. Again, here also there's so much which could be said, Nicole, but I want to be certain that others have the opportunity to engage.
I appreciate that, because I think we saw some of that same trend happen in the wireless space, right? I would think that over the years, we've seen increased participation in established entities is what I hear you saying, Landry, which is another way in. Bruno, what about your thought on this? How do we get more voices to the table, more people actually bringing their opinions to these larger scale established institutions as well as coalitions?
Yes. I'd like, first of all, to establish a dialogue between the points that were raised by Ashta and also Landry. I think, yeah, we should not underestimate the geopolitical complex issues behind of this agenda. Yeah, and one of the key words that are being used, at least to diminish the stress between this agenda, is interoperability, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of governance, or even from the regulatory point of view. That's why we are seeing OECD abandon the term harmonization and use interoperability, because it's impossible to harmonize all interests, but it's possible to establish a dialogue between them. But then we have this huge risk. What it means regulatory interoperability, technological interoperability, because we can also see a kind of legal colonization, tech colonization, and so on. That's why it was so important that Ashta highlighted that data being considered as infrastructure, we are going to do and do some political choice in a way that could be emancipatory as well. So, for instance, if what does mean if India and Brazil really wants to build financial or payment infrastructure? It passes something for the world, or even when we are doing some choice with regards, what does it mean if Brazil puts as one of its priority build a data infrastructure for combat or address deforestation. You know, because data is not like raw, data is not the oil, but data is being cooked. We do our political choice and technological choice in that regard. So I'm curious to see how this interplay between regulation, governance, and also national policies would produce some results that might be interesting to see from the geopolitical point of view. And as Ashta said, like we have a pretty interesting platform, because for the first time in the history, G20 is going to have like a South Troika, a South-South Troika, passing from India to Brazil and from Brazil to South Africa. Yeah. So it's a really nice platform, a really nice, unique moment that we can have this conversation by having those countries under the presence and talking in an equal way with the global north. Yes. And we are going to see policy briefs in that direction. And I'm hopeful and optimistic, as Ashta said previously, in that regard.
No, I'm optimistic too. I've been watching it. Landry, and then I'll go to Chinasa and Ashta. Go ahead, Landry.
And I just want to add that the African Union has also been adopted as a new member of the G20, so which is another unique opportunity to frame the broader agenda, including related to the question of AI. And congratulations to India for doing this so beautifully. We discussed it during a meeting at Davos, and we are very happy that it finally happened.
Oh, wow, this is exciting stuff. Chinasa and Ashta, you want to jump in there too on just how to continue to move this geopolitical conversation forward?
Yeah, one thing I'll quickly say is that, governance or the development of governance initiatives when it comes to AI regulation should not be solely left to governmental stakeholders. I think it's really important, to engage civil society, academic members, and also more importantly, like community stakeholders, just like the common person. And so it's really, we want to ensure that their perspectives are, I would say, included in these conversations as well. I would say the United States and the UK have done a relatively good job of, having these kinds of stakeholders involved, in AI governance conversations. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, both within like this on this side of the world, and also like within the global South in general.
Yeah, just a shameless plug for Chinasa. Her research was on rural healthcare in India, am I correct, Chinasa? And how they actually utilize AI. And if you read that research that she's going to publish more on, it speaks to what we talked about, the data economy and data workers and how everyday people sort of engage these technologies. So thank you for saying that, because I think that's so true, that we have to look at the granular aspect of how these technologies affect and impact people and their communities. I'll start for you. And then after that, friends, we're going to go over to Q&A because there's a few questions in our queue.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I think that, G20, and as everyone said, is an interesting thing. There's the Global Partnership for AI, which India is at the helm of. So that's another interesting opportunity. But also, I think we have to think about some of these agendas, right? Then when Japan was the president of G20, they were talking about data free flow with trust. We didn't sign on to that. Even India's digital public infrastructure agenda is maybe not going to pass on to Brazil. And, Bruno and the rest of the Brazilian civil society is working very hard to see how these agendas talk to one another. So I think this tussle between global collaboration and, digital sovereignty or ideas around digital sovereignty is going to come into tussle. And it's all, it's going to be certain amounts of friction. And I think it's up to us as the stakeholders into this process to talk about it. Opportunities like the Global Digital Compact, which we'll see next year, the negotiations around that is another one where I think there's value for multi-stakeholderism. However, coming from the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, I also realized that it seems to be that multilateralism is back on the upswing. So I think that for people who are watchers, doers, participants into the broader framework of internet governance, I think it's an interesting inflection point for us as a community to see what these inroads are for us. And if it's going to be negotiations between nation states with very specific agendas, then I think that the broader question for us as civil society more broadly is going to be as to how we come into the framework, because we've had a good run since Net Mundial. But I think that things are going to have changed over the last 10 odd years. So that's just a thought that I wanted to leave this, because Nicol, as we think about the agenda for engagement, I think that the realities of how the conversations are unfolding will also have to inform what we do next.
Yeah, and that is such a great insight, because I think, to your point, we're actually seeing these conversations shift a little bit. I know I have as well. And the question really becomes for all of us on this call, the extent to which, again, the existing norms, values, and protocols that different countries have already innovated, the extent to which they actually get adopted now into this new G20, it's a possibility to be heard and much more visible. But then the other question is, as this technology continues to change, generative AI being another point in this conversation. And the reason I didn't talk about it, because somebody sent a question about it. So I'm actually going to pivot it into that question. But obviously, as the technology changes and evolves, that also changes the nature of the conversations that we continue to have, meaning we're not static as well in our conversations. So let me actually go to that question on generative AI. Because I didn't bring it up because I was going to, and then I saw this question. I said, hey, I'm gonna leave this for Q&A. This is from Mariana Jallo, who is the Director of Alliance for Innovative Regulation, who sent this question. How could generative AI benefit financial consumers and regulators in emerging markets? What are the particular use cases in emerging markets for generative AI that are most helpful? Could it be deployed more quickly and easier in countries with newer digital native financial services and regulatory structures that do not have to layer new technology on top of older analog infrastructure? So in many respects, this question is interesting because it actually brings in this new, more trendy form of AI, but it also speaks a little bit to what you all spoke about, which is this financial infrastructure that has been encased in a history of development that now has this new format sort of overlaying on that. So I'll open it up to anybody on that question, and maybe to ping us a little bit on the generative AI question that is sort of the $1 million question out there among all of us. Anybody on that question from Mariama on generative AI and financial systems? Ashta.
Yeah, I mean, it's a broader question beyond financial systems, though financial systems are embedded in it. I mean, access to schemes and programs in India has been facilitated entirely almost by the government trying to provide information to people, whether it's loan repayments, whether it's credit systems, etc. Now with generative AI, a lot of this is being managed through WhatsApp practically, where voice-enabled systems, you can, put in a query, and at the back of it, there's generative AI that enables a reasonable response. So the question of what it means for emerging markets is, I think, better information, better access to financial services, but also I suspect questions of bias. For instance, models are being trained on male voices because that's the amount of information that is available, or certain languages that have information available on financial systems. So if you're a woman who's speaking a minority language, which is not Hindi or English or some of the other major ones, then what does that mean for you as a user or a recipient of financial services? So I think that obviously, as always, we have to think about what are the possibilities, but also what are the harms. And I think that as generative AI, particularly for very, very, important and useful places such as financial services, where the question for both harm as well as value is very high, it will become, something that needs to be regulated actively and considered.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to add on to that in terms of generative AI's role?
So I think that Asta made a brilliant point and providing very specific illustrations, and really an additional dimensions which could be added here is he could help also enhance fraud detection. So I think that's a key dimension by identifying patterns of behavior among other. In the context of, in the African context also, of course, the quality of service which could be provided to customers, especially in remote area, in rural areas. So that is an important dimension. Asta mentioned the question of the linguistic question. So in Africa, we have over 2,000 local languages. So for about, so that is also another important dimension which could help provide better services and the cost reduction. So as we know, M-Pesa, when it comes to the market as part of the previous industrial revolution, has already made a monumental difference. Only that technology in some area has contributed to reduce by about 2% poverty or extreme poverty in some of the area on the continent. So I think those are some of the dimensions which could really help for which Gen AI could really help unlock the potential. And let me conclude by also saying credit. Credit is a complex dimension on the continent where many people do not have access to credit, including especially this smaller entrepreneurs. Stop there. Thank you.
Well, you know, it's so funny. We have a blog coming out on the linguistic constraints of generative AI. Myself and co-author Regina Ta, who was at Stanford University, who spent this summer with us from the HAI Institute, we actually wrote this blog around some of the challenges that we may have that actually may contribute to a digital language divide, as we see more large language models become much more trained and contextualized on some of the more dominant languages and not the linguistic variation that we actually know and understand. So more to come on that. Look for the Tech Tank newsletter. You'll actually see that blog come up in the next couple of days. Question number 2. I don't know how many of you on this call are going to the UK's forthcoming AI Safety Summit, which is in November. Just question that somebody had was, is this considered to be part of this institutional radar when it comes to where our voices need to be showing up? Or is this something that is not necessarily going to be a Global South angle? So not sure if anybody wants to answer that about the AI Safety Summit that's coming up, where people are. Chinasa.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to it. I think I'm also allowed to announce that I will be in attendance at the summit. I believe that the formal list is being released tomorrow, so we'll actually be able to get a better understanding of who will be in attendance. And so I would say for me, the event has been, just from what I can share, been structured as to seem like very inclusive of stakeholders that are from not solely the, I would say, based like in big tech companies, you know, as we saw in meetings that happened within the US, for example, or hosted by the US government. And so hopefully I think that with this, you know, more diverse or more inclusive way of inviting people, that we probably will have like much richer discussions. And also ministers from different countries have been invited to partake in both days of the summit. And so I think this will provide like very interesting questions as to how like these ministers from different countries can contribute to, you know, this global discourse on AI regulation. So yeah, I would say it would be pretty significant, but I can share more after I attend, of course.
Thank you so much. And then the last question before we wrap up, I'm wondering if the speakers could address any regulations or policies surrounding critical minerals, mining concerns. I want to say generally, just to sort of adapt this question, some of the climate concerns, go into a little bit more detail about the climate concerns. Bruno, you want to pick that one up?
Yes, because we are discussing right now in Brazil 5 or 6 AI draft bills in the parliament. One of them, I was involved being part of the Commission of Jurists that was created by the Brazilian Senate. And it's been quite interesting, the discussion in that regard. Because here, again, the regulation can play a critical role in terms of innovation. For instance, by providing that climate is a critical factor to verify if an AI is considered as a high risk or not, and also what are the duties of all the stakeholders in a very complex supply chain as well. So this is specific draft bill that I worked. We have some interesting guidelines in terms of not only quantitative criteria, but also qualitative criteria in that regard. And once again, like, if you have like a risk-based approach, how we can see that the regulation would be, let's say, more flexible in a way that we could create an AI, generative AI, to map automated decision-making in terms of deforestation and so on. Like, the benefits are greater than the risks, and therefore the regulatory burden would be much lower. So we are having this discussion because there are some narratives that are wrong, that the regulation would kill that kind of innovation, and it's pretty much the contrary. So I think now we are addressing this kind of conversation in a way that we are having more sophisticated discussions about what kind of taxonomy of risks would inspire regulation.
Thank you so much for that. That makes a lot of sense, given the fact that, as I think we all realize as we wrap up this conversation, that this has really been a conversation that's been happening for quite some time. What our goal is at Brookings is to just bring more profile and visibility to those dialogues that are occurring across the world, and ensuring that we not only capture from what you heard some of the cultural efficacy that's coming out of different nations, but also this conversation on how these conversations can be collaborative and helpful moving forward, and actually have moving targets, but also set standards that allow us to create a global AI universe. I'm really, really interested as we have this conversation at Brookings. Just want to put out there as I wrap up, obviously my colleague Cam Carey and Josh Meltzer, both of my colleagues there, are working on transatlantic conversations, of which this is a part, but also as we have this conversation to really refocus our attention under this guise of equity around data workers. So hopefully, Chinasa, we will come back to that as you take on this project. Landry, continue to work with the Africa Growth Initiative around these issues. Asa and Bruno, thank you. I will continue to be in touch with you, because it sounds like at some point all y'all are going to be together and I won't be there because I will be stuck in a pixel or somewhere in the United States doing other work. My point is, thank you everybody again for joining us. Be on the lookout for some future research and policy around these particular verticals. Stay in touch with us. And as we said, we'll be posting some stuff on our Tech Tank blog, as well as having these conversations on our Tech Tank podcast. Again, thank you for spending your hour with us at the Brookings Institution. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye, Bruno. Thanks so much, Nicole.